Welcome to this press conference by the three Human Rights Council Special Procedures mandate holders who presented their reports and had their interactive dialogue with the General Assembly's third committee this morning. So we have with us Mr. Michael Fakhri, Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Mr. Pedro Arrojo-Agudo, Special Rapporteur on the human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation, and Mr. Balakrishnan Rajagopal, Special Rapporteur on adequate housing as a component of the right to an adequate standard of living and on the right to non-discrimination in this context. So all three experts were appointed by the Human Rights Council in 2020. And I will just invite each of them to say a few words and then we'll take some questions. Mr. Fakhri, shall we start with you?
Great, thank you. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming, especially on this sunny Friday afternoon. So I really value your time and your hard work today. Today I'm speaking to my report that I just addressed before the Third Committee of the General Assembly, entitled Starvation and the Right to Food, with an emphasis on the Palestinian people's food sovereignty. So I'll just highlight some of the things that I discuss in the report. First thing that I do in the report is just really focus on the definition of starvation and famine. What does it even mean? The reason I do that is currently under international law, starvation is primarily understood as a humanitarian issue, as a violation of the laws of war, as an international criminal, as a matter of international criminal law. And the limit of that is multiple limits to that. One, conceptually, that starvation doesn't happen overnight and it doesn't happen just in war. Starvation is the result of choices that are made over decades. You have decades of slow violence, and then when that moment of starvation happens, often in the context of war, it's like flipping a switch, right? So the question is, how was it even possible for one group to starve another? In the report, so it looks into that you have to look at the political economy, you have to look at systemic human rights violations that are happening over decades in the food system. You're looking at land grabs, occupation, the commodification of seeds, etc. The other limit of only thinking about starvation in terms of international humanitarian law and international criminal law is in terms of accountability. As you know, probably, that the current prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is seeking warrants for two Israeli leaders, and part of the claim is crimes of starvation. And I'm following this case closely, and we'll see what happens, and I think that's important to hold individuals accountable. But it's not just bad people doing bad things. How were those individuals able to do this? This is a systemic issue. We should be able to hold countries and corporations accountable. On the specific issue of the Palestinian people's food sovereignty, this report answers a very specific question. How was Israel able to starve 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza so quickly and so completely? We have never seen in modern history this speed of starvation ever. And the report answers that question. Of course, this doesn't start in October 7. You can go back multiple points in time. You can go back to 2000, when Israel began its blockade against Gaza. So in 1991, Israel starts to restrict the flow of goods and people in Gaza. By 2000, it's now has its military and settlers occupying Gaza, and they impose a blockade, causing profound rates of hunger and malnutrition. And around 2005, by 2007, Israel withdraws its military and removes its settlers, but now imposes a siege. So it continues its occupation of Gaza by controlling and blocking the border. So from 2000 to 2023, Israel has a profound degree of control over Gaza. And it's like a faucet that you tighten and loosen. And they would make sure that the Palestinians in Gaza were just hungry enough to not raise alarms. They were counting calories and measuring what is allowed in to make sure that everyone remained hungry in Gaza, but not so hungry that it raised alarm bells in the international humanitarian world. So that on October 6th, 2023, half of people in Gaza were food insecure and 80% depended on humanitarian aid. Which is why then when Israel declared its starvation campaign on October 9th of 2023, by December, we suspected everyone in Gaza, by December, everyone in Gaza was hungry. And I spoke to the world's leading famine experts, and they said, we didn't even know how to measure famine this quickly. They didn't know it was so unique. But of course, it's not just Gaza. This is not a war in Gaza. This is an Israeli assault against the Palestinian people. In the last 2 years, we've seen record violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, especially peasants and farmers and shepherds. We've seen, I just put out a press release yesterday, I believe, on the increased violence and the uprooting and burning of olive trees. What's at stake with the olive tree? Olive trees live for thousands of years. It is people's relationship to their ancestors, and how they take care of olive trees is how they are taking care of future generations. When Israeli forces and settlers are uprooting olive trees, this is an attack against the Palestinian people as a people. This is part of this genocidal campaign. The attack against UNRWA is not just a UN agency. It is a UN agency that ensures the food security for Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the occupied Palestinian territories. UNRWA also holds the land claims for many Palestinian people when they were made refugees in the Nakba in 47, 48. So by attacking UNRWA, what Israel is trying to do is undermine the Palestinian people's right to return to their homes, to their territory, to Palestine itself. So that is what at stake. Benjamin Netanyahu announced Israel's annexation plan in the General Assembly in September 2023. And that's what's happening today. This is an attempt to use starvation to displace people, to kill people, to annihilate people, as an attempt to erase the Palestinians from history and from their land in order for Israel to fully annex Palestinian territory. And we see that their annexation plan continues now into Lebanon. I look forward to your questions, and I'll turn it over to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So maybe let's go to the next, to Mr. Arrojo.
Thank you. Well, as I stressed in my report on the nexus water and food under a human rights-based approach, I stressed that the global water and food crisis are strongly linked. And with climate change, this connection has become more crucial than ever. Public policies leading to an agroecological transition and a water transition from a human rights-based approach are vital from my point of view. Current food systems are based on the myth that production can grow indefinitely, also in tremendous power asymmetries and a blind faith in markets to distribute food to those who need it. But in fact, this is leading us to an unsustainable and unjust situation. This is the key issue. Among the many factors determining the magnitude of food's water footprint, the main are production strategy, dominant diets, and food waste. Look, regarding the impact of dominant diets, for instance, shifting from meat-based to healthier diets can reduce the water footprint by more than 30%. And another reference, food waste accounts for a third of all food produced. That is more than enough water to guarantee the human right to drinking water worldwide. In addition, the current dominant food and water systems don't prioritize public health. This translates not only into 2 billion people without guaranteed access to safe drinking water and 800 million hungry people, but also into 2.5 billion overweight people, mostly impoverished people living in food environments based on ultra-processed food and sugary drinks, which generate serious health problems and a huge water footprint at the same time. The widespread use of industrial pesticides and fertilizers, and on the other hand, and the concentrated production of slurry also from intensive livestock farming place at present the agricultural sector at the forefront of toxic water pollution and the eutrophication of water bodies. So, in another aspect, land and water grabbing for developing monocultures destroy rural communities and traditional knowledge, and leading to deforestation and degrading the regenerative capacity of soil fertility. Well, in summary, there is no future on this path. We need, I insist, an agroecological transition and a water transition from a human right-based approach which guides strategies for adaptation to climate change. I explain in the plenary, subsidies to current modes of production and consumption total an estimated $540 billion annually. Redirecting this public funding to support the agroecological transition will enable the development of healthier, more sustainable, equitable, and efficient food systems. It's not impossible, it's feasible, absolutely. There is plenty of room, I insist on this, for us to develop a new concept of progress that falls between the minimum human rights threshold that ensures a dignified life for all and the upper limit of sustainability. But for this, a shift, I insist, towards agroecological practices that ensure human rights compliance while respecting environmental sustainability is needed. Finally, today, both my colleagues, the rapporteurs on the human right to food and housing, have denounced in their reports the use of hunger and the massive destruction of homes, domiciled, in war strategies, particularly in Gaza, but not only, but particularly in Gaza. I would like to stress that these strategies include, as a key element, the use of water as a silent weapon, a silent bomb, silent but not less lethal, especially for children. So I have underlined that if we allow international legality to be ignored, to continue to be ignored, in such essential areas, the very existence of the United Nations and the viability of the democratic future of the world are seriously threatened. Thank you very much.
And let's go now to Mr. Rajagopal.
Thank you, and thank you again for joining us. As the Special Rapporteur on Food said, on a Friday afternoon, I'm sure there are better things you would be doing at this point. The issues that are faced in terms of housing are profound and constantly shaping both domestic and world events as we speak. We all know that in election after election in OECD countries, among the most prominent political issues is the question of housing. Governments fall or rise based on the housing issue. We have seen that in Europe. It's a central issue in the United States now, the election coming up in a month, where the question of housing is part of the broader sort of challenges that ordinary people face in terms of the affordability crisis. And I submitted a report on the global affordable housing crisis a year ago. I do see there is a very strong link between the approaches to issues like affordability and the easy sort of attempt by politicians to find a scapegoat for the affordability crisis by pointing their fingers at migrants. I found, for example, during my country visit to Netherlands in last December that that seemed to be what was happening. there was an acute housing crisis ongoing, but it was too easy to sort of point to the migrants, particularly not the Ukrainian refugees, of which there are millions or hundreds of thousands in Netherlands, but those who come from non-Western countries as scapegoats. This we see repeatedly, especially in rich countries. I will dedicate my next report to the Human Rights Council to migration and the right to adequate housing. But today's report is really about a silent crisis that is with us, which is that on the one hand, we have a first crisis, which is that forced evictions are going on and increasing very rapidly around the world, mainly because of three reasons. One is because of conflict, one of the main sort of drivers of forced evictions, the reason why people get displaced in the first place. And those numbers have been going up very sharply. As UNHCR data, for example, points out, there is a very sharp increase from 110 million in May 2023 to more than 114 million. More than 90% of these people live in low and middle income countries. Conflict, of course, drives people across the border as well in terms of refugee flows. We know that over 6 million Ukrainians have ended up in other countries, including almost 4 million in Poland, for example. We know that the Sudan crisis is actually causing a displacement of over 10 million people, of which almost 7 million are internally displaced, but the others have fled to other neighboring countries. But in addition to conflict, Gaza, of course, and the overall situation in the Middle East has long been a driver of internal displacement as well as cross-border refugee flows. But in addition to conflict, we have very, very problematic sort of scenarios emerging in terms of the displacement caused by climate change and disasters. Increasingly, there is an enormous threat emerging from the number of people, especially in vulnerable areas, including the Pacific islands, the Central American or some South American countries, certain African countries. For example, over 900,000 people in Somalia are displaced because of climate change-related issues. Desertification, stress in terms of the salinity of the system, including the soil systems that we depend on for cultivation of food, not the rising ocean levels. That very well is coming down the line, but often that is a scenario that people tend to focus a lot more on because it looks like some Hollywood movie coming our way with ocean level rise. But the reality of climate change impacts are slow and relentless, and they displace people. It's like a slow sort of process of expiry of a community. And then we have the biggest elephant in the room, in addition to conflict and climate change, which is development. The decisions that are taken in our names, in the so-called public interest, for removing some people out of their homes in order to put that space to better use. And we justified for a number of reasons, from large infrastructure projects to new city building to increasingly conservation in the name of protecting, for example, the targets that countries have agreed on for climate change purposes, including for carbon credit schemes. I increasingly receive complaints from communities around the world who have been displaced, whose homes have been burned down by their own governments because they've signed contracts with companies to sell carbon credits. Unfortunately, these multiple forms of forced displacement is the first crisis. But the second crisis, which is what my report focuses on, is a silent crisis, because the question is what happens to people when they get forcibly displaced? What happens to them? It turns out that there is not a very good understanding or even data about where they are exactly. Under international law, there is an obligation to resettle people who are displaced. But very few governments and very few international organizations who are responsible for displacement actually take responsibility for resettling them. I called attention to this as a silent global crisis during my report to the UN Human Rights Council in March. In this report that I just presented, had a dialogue with this morning, I said if it is such a large crisis, what are the sort of the practices that we find? what are states, international organizations, and development finance institutions, private sector, what are they doing? Who is doing better? Who is actually found wanting in a number of different ways in terms of a human rights framework? My next step in that process is to develop a set of global guiding principles on resettlement, which I will develop and engage in regional consultations over the next year, and present them to the UN Human Rights Council in March of 2026. And I had a very good exchange of views on this issue, and I hope to have an impact in changing the unfortunate reality that we have with us today, which is that forced evictions are going up, but we just haven't figured out what to do and how to deal with the people who are getting displaced. The answer cannot simply be that they should just be forgotten or that they'll take care of themselves. That's not how it works.
Okay, now we'll open for questions.
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. I have a question for each of you. For Mr. Fakhri, Israel contends that it is supplying enough food, that it's provided, I believe, 1 million tons of food. How do you answer that? Have you spoken to the Israelis about your latest report, and what kind of a reaction have you gotten? And for Mr. Arrojo-Agudo, you mentioned that water's being used as a silent weapon, I believe, in Gaza. Could you elaborate on Gaza? I know that the major pipelines have been broken. There's been a lot of trouble getting water into Gaza, desalination plants not working. If you could address that. And to Mr. Balakrishnan, so as I believe 70% of the infrastructure in Gaza has been destroyed. How long do you think, whenever this war ends, it's going to take to actually do enough rebuilding so that people can live in anything other than tents? And do you have any suggestions? Thank you.
Which we will go to answers immediately, and then.
Great. Thank you, Edith, and I've read your work before, and thank you for following this issue so closely. From what I have not directly communicated with Israel, they did not attend today's session. However, I have raised this issue since October 2023, where Israel has been present, and to date, Israel has not denied or provided a substantive argument against the claim that me and many of my colleagues have made, that what they are doing is using starvation and engaging in genocide. To your question more specifically, what Israel has said is that that adequate calories are entering into Gaza. I have several responses to that. One, calories are not food. Two, based on a year-long starvation campaign and a 24-year blockade and siege, allowing a few more trucks to enter in now does not actually address the humanitarian needs. But most importantly, what Israel is saying contradicts everything every humanitarian organization is saying now and has been saying. I have spoken to humanitarian organizations, UN and otherwise, directly, and the consistent message from them has been and remains that Israel's rules on what is allowed in to Gaza is opaque and absurd. It's a system designed to be confused, to make it very difficult for aid to enter. Then, if we look over the last year, whenever humanitarian aid actually makes it through, those convoys often are shot at and targeted by Israeli forces, even though those convoys are coordinating with the IDF. And then even if those convoys get past that, civilians seeking aid have been shot at and killed several times. I'll add even more. Israel has imposed a full siege against Gaza, and especially northern Gaza, at several moments. So just because, even if it were true, that Israel is allowing in a few more trucks today, that does not mean that they are not starving the Palestinians in Gaza. To deny people objects necessary for their survival is starvation. Israel announced their starvation campaign multiple times. They have done so multiple times. So even if we believe what they're saying is true, that they're allowing in more trucks, that doesn't change the fact that this is still a starvation campaign. Thank you.
Well, with respect regarding water, you know, the strip in Gaza has just one natural water source, is the aquifer, the coastal aquifer. Well, during the past time, before, you know, the war, and during the time in which we had the blockade for 15 years, more or less, the people in Gaza is more than 2 million people,
2.3.
but 1.6 people are, they are not living there because they want. They have been expelled from their houses, from their territories, and they're in refugee camps. So this crowded population needed to pump water, 3 times more water than the rate of replenishment, natural replenishment of the aquifer. So that deals with a salination, massive salinization of the aquifer from the past. And on the other side, before the war, what you had is 70% of the materials needed for instance, sanitation plants, for building and managing sanitation plants, has been considered dual-use materials, so blocked, not allowed. So what happens? Very poor sanitation processes and contamination with fecal matter of the aquifers. This was before the war. So the only way of having water for drinking water was the desalination plants, and an amount of water sold by Mekorot, the public-owned company, Israeli company, to the Palestinians. But with the beginning of the war, this water was cut off at the beginning completely, and then a little bit more, less, but cut it essentially, and with cutting off the energy, the desalination plant collapsed. So what is the situation at present? Amount 4.7 liters per person per day availability of water, but most of this water is polluted. So it's not just the scarcity, but is the contamination and diseases, especially for children. And this is why I talk about that we have a silent bomb. It's not spectacular, you know. These thousands and thousands of people, children mainly, that without health care and with this contamination and this salinization of available water, they suffer and they dead. It's a silent but lethal bomb.
I think We need to back up a little bit from October of 2023 because the question of how much of Gaza has been destroyed should not give the mistaken impression of assuming that Gaza was fully built and intact before that. No part of Palestine, whether it's East Jerusalem or West Bank or Gaza, have been exempt from a gradual and sometimes violent pummeling given by Israel using military force or using home demolitions, which have been a chief tool of occupation and land annexation, including settlement activity in the West Bank over decades. So let's not first give the impression that Gaza was a fully built, untouched urban environment. It was an urban environment. 77.6% of Gaza was urban. So it was partially ruined landscape. All of Palestine was partially ruined even before October of 2023. And what we have seen since October in the last 1 year is a biblical, unprecedented form of reign of destruction, the kind of which I have not seen in any modern conflict. And I have been studying and researching international relations for 30 years. I have not seen any conflict resemble the ferocity of what we have witnessed. Not in Aleppo, not in Homs, not in Ukraine where we are seeing. And going back to World War II, if you compare the destruction of Dresden, or if you compare the destruction of Amsterdam or Cologne, nothing comes close to the scale and the intensity of destruction that we have seen. And in terms of how much of Gaza is destroyed is at this stage a kind of a difficult sort of game, because we knew back in January of 2024 that 60 to 70% of all homes have been destroyed in Gaza already, with areas in northern Gaza destroyed up to 82%. This was based on satellite imagery that I had reviewed carefully. So the issue is that it is far worse than that right now. Given that almost the entire population of Gaza is displaced, the level of destruction in certain areas of Gaza, particularly northern Gaza, is approaching levels of 100%. It's not 70% anymore. And one has to ask, what is really the goal or the military objective of destruction of this scale, which no other military power in any recent conflict has seen necessary in order to win a war? If truly what's going on in Gaza is a war, the purpose of war is victory. But what is the metric of victory here? I've been unable to understand given the scale of this destruction. And I've noticed, especially as I said earlier, even with my remarks about resettlement, the increasing number of conflicts where, because of planetary urbanization, more and more people just live in urban areas. Built environment gets hit during warfare, far more than, for example, the old conflicts with trench warfare where troops would fight, outside of cities, facing each other. That's not warfare anymore. We are not in World War I anymore. And with some exceptions, for example, the conflict in Sudan or the conflict that we've been seeing in Myanmar, because of the large percentage of rural populations that are on the receiving end of the military actions, we don't find the level of physical destruction that we see, say, in Ukraine or in Gaza. But the reality is that in most countries, increasingly, as countries become more and more urbanized, Gaza is going to be the future of the planet. If we don't stop it now, this is what we are looking at. So then we come to your question, how long will it take then to get out of this? What do we do about all this rubble? And a recent UNDP report estimated that there are over 39 million tons of debris as of May of this year. The debris is as much as, if you stack them up vertically, it's about 8 times the height of the entire Central Park of New York, or 11 times the volume of the Great Pyramid of Giza. So we are talking a level of rubble mixed with unexploded ordnances, toxic waste, asbestos from, for example, collapsed buildings that are yet to be assessed, let alone be cleared. The groundwater pollution and the soil contamination are so catastrophic that we don't know if they can ever be remedied in time for people to move back, at least within this generation. So that is the first, there is the issue of debris removal, and then there is the issue of generating enough sort of not just financial resources, which is enormous at this stage, that is needed for rebuilding, but also the human resources necessary for rebuilding the territory. There is another big elephant in the room, which is that no reconstruction of any kind can happen unless the occupation ends. Because the reality is that in any of the past attempts at rebuilding after wars were unleashed on Gaza, very little rebuilding could go on because of the supply on, say, dual-use materials or the restrictions on, say, earth-moving equipment to come in to push the debris out of the way. Large trucks are needed, for example, but everything is seen by Israel as dual use, and they are the ones who approve what comes in and what goes out. And when you have a situation like that, what you end up with is what we saw after 2014, after the 2014 war on Gaza. Between 2014 and 2019, how many homes were built every year? Less than 1,000 homes. So the UNDP recent report that looked at estimated time to rebuild Gaza gives it a timeline of about 80 years. Assuming that occupation continues, it's about 1,000 homes a year you can do. Why? Because the destruction is estimated by UNDP to have about 79,000 houses, about 80,000 houses roughly. So you're looking really at 80 years if occupation continues. So any way to systematically and rapidly get out of the current situation within the lifetime of the smallest child in Gaza right now involves ending the occupation now. Otherwise, that child will never see his or her home rebuilt ever again. That's basically where we are.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Justicia Shipena, a Dag Hammarskjöld's fellow, also a journalist from Namibia. You spoke briefly in terms of conflict and housing. I just wanted to get, is this the same situation in the African continent? Are you seeing that the African populace is also face their rights to housing is also being violated due to these conflicts? And we have also seen that fertilizer prices are finally starting to stabilize after that continuous increase since 2022. Has this stabilization affected the rights of food or water in any way? In terms of housing, and when we do speak of elections, my country, Namibia, as well as other African countries, are heading to the polls. Namibia is having elections next month, but it also faces a large number of affordable housing, as well as where individuals either lose their homes due to affordability, but also due to land disputes. And these politicians and governments then use this in their campaigns to deliver on this, to want to deliver on these promises. Have these politicians, in your opinion, answered to the rights of housing in these African countries? And two more questions, sorry. On carbon credits, what measures should be put in place to ensure that carbon credit programs do not lead to that housing loss? And while we are on that, have you observed any loss of housing for individuals due to large renewable energy scale projects by governments, for example, green nitrogen projects? And if there is an increase in this, what is causing this increase? And is this also due to agreements that are signed, as you've indicated, like the carbon credits? Thank you.
Several questions. Start with the housing.
Africa, on the one hand, African Union and Africa collectively has taken very forward-looking steps when it comes to, frankly, acknowledging forced displacement as a crisis and in putting forth legal frameworks for dealing with them. The only really most persuasive or binding soft international law guideline we have in internal displacement is the 1998 Guiding Principles on Displacement. That was developed by none other than Francis Deng, the former UN Special Rapporteur on IDPs, internally displaced persons, from Sudan. And the development of consensus around those principles has led African countries to adopt the only legally binding international agreement on displacement in the world right now, which is the Kampala Convention. So in terms of international law frameworks and also in terms of the many judicial opinions I've seen from the African court, for example, on human and people's rights, it's actually certainly at the vanguard. But that is, as with other continents and countries, there is often a huge gap between aspiration and reality on the ground in terms of what countries are actually able to do to make sure that when displacements happen, including because of conflict, that there is an adequate response. And the affordable housing crisis in Africa is real. Africa is, after all, the fastest urbanizing continent of all the continents. Housing is constantly in short supply or rising very rapidly in prices, with much of the even middle class finding it very difficult to afford housing in locations where it makes sense for them to access jobs or schooling or hospitals. It's a real huge issue. Conflicts, of course, have a massive impact in many African countries. At the current moment, of course, in Sudan, but there are many lingering issues, including in the Sahel, but also in, of course, in Somalia, and then we have, of course, the remnants of the Congo Second World War, as you could call it, that has actually left a vast swathe of territories with displaced populations who are not settled, who have been living, for example, as cross-border refugees for years. So, for example, the very large number of Sudanese and Somali population in a country like Kenya is a huge issue. And I know that recently Kenya has been taking some very encouraging steps to try to legalize the presence of those communities and convert the refugee settlements into urban settlements, which is a very forward-looking sort of step to take. So I think that, as with many continents, what you have in the case of Africa is a mixed bag, a forward-looking framework, but reality is quite wanting in terms of what you see on the ground. Carbon credits are having a huge impact. Conservation efforts are having a massive impact. Conservation efforts are increasingly linked to mitigation, and of course, mitigation is also sought to be achieved by the use of, carbon credits. And you have many examples of countries where communities have been violently displaced from their homes, and their homes have been burned down. Those who protested have been arrested or displaced, or their home registration has been withdrawn, or they've been delisted as communities in countries like Tanzania, for example. So this is a massive issue that we see happening. And to my regret, unfortunately, what I find, and I reported this morning to the third committee, is that international organizations, including certain UN agencies like UNESCO, are complicit in these kinds of massive human rights abuses. So the Ngorongoro, a crater is actually designated as a World Heritage Site in Tanzania, for example. But we've had some very concerning developments when it comes to large-scale eviction and displacement of communities. And unfortunately, UNESCO has gone along with these practices. So I called on the states today, the dialogue today, to really ensure that when it comes to at least the UN agencies, they must step up their game. They cannot be parties to these kinds of violations. So I remain very concerned about these issues.
Maybe I'll speak to the fertilizer question. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a complicated relationship between fertilizer and the right to food. In the immediate term, we saw this when Russia invaded and occupied Ukraine a couple of years ago, in that so many farms depended on fertilizer. And so any disruption to a fertilizer supply chain creates a moment of instability for food security. But the dependency on fertilizer in and of itself is deeply problematic for two reasons. From an environmental perspective, the heavy use of fertilizer leads to pollution. But second, Oh, I guess I should use this. But second, I was putting it aside. But second, it makes farmers dependent on imports and foreign corporations. And from a right to food perspective, what farmers should be doing is gradually weaning themselves off of chemical fertilizers so that it's better for the environment and that they are less dependent on these foreign corporations and less vulnerable to geopolitics and fluctuating markets. From an agrarian perspective, it is possible. It is possible to grow enough food for the world without using chemical fertilizers. It just requires different techniques.
So, a reference, a positive reference in the African continent related with water. It was very more. I have studied the problem more last year with my precedent report, but I tell you the reference of very positive in terms of water management in transboundary basins. You know. It could be said that the African continent is the world leader in agreements for the management of transboundary basins, river basins, in the very difficult conditions posed by climate change for the future. I always cite the references of the Senegal River basin, the Niger River, the Okavango River, and the Lake Chad basin. Wow. These agreements at international level give a reference, a leadership in some way. It is, of course, it doesn't guarantee overcoming the problems caused by droughts and floods in the future, but they offer better conditions and shared responsibilities for dealing with them instead of promoting the next war, regional war around this kind of important issue. So I wanted just not to say it's very nice, no, not at all, but also to recognize this African leadership on the water management in transboundary basins.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Dag Hammarskjöld Fellow from Occupied Palestine. As you mentioned, and according to reports from Gaza, the Israeli occupation destroyed the infrastructure needed for self-sufficiency. The reports indicate a complete destruction of agricultural land and pollution of groundwater. I know you mentioned this, but I want to know more about how do you see the long-term danger of this for Gaza?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because that highlights that when we're talking about Israel's starvation campaign, it's not just the denial and restriction of humanitarian aid, it's the destruction of the food system itself. And so first I'll just highlight how they've been doing so. They've been destroying orchards, then been poisoning the land with the use of white phosphorus. They're attacking fishers and peasants themselves. But also they've been denying fishers access to the sea and restricting their access to the sea for decades. So it's been going on for decades, and this is just the accelerated version. And now there's increased creation of so-called buffer zones, which is taking over agricultural land. What this does is it makes it very difficult then for the Palestinian people to feed themselves. This is their food sovereignty. And this is why we're calling it genocide. When you undermine a people's relationship to the land and you undermine the people's ability to feed themselves with dignity, then you are trying to annihilate a people as such. That's what's at stake. And so that's exactly what Israel is doing, is trying to make it impossible to think about a future, right? So one of the most powerful things that the Palestinians are doing to preserve this is they're saving their seeds, they're saving their recipes, this is knowledge, right? This is at the heart of what's happening. And this is why Israel targets the food system in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. Yeah. So what's at stake is the very future of the Palestinian people when we think of it in those terms. And again, that's why it's important to not just focus on the humanitarian aid, but the destruction of the food system.
Perhaps just to add that we are focused at present because it's so incredible what is happening in Gaza. But it's not just in Gaza. If we look at West Bank, from a long time ago, from under the occupation, look, even in the territories illegally occupied in Palestine, Palestinians have not the right to approach the river, the Jordan River. Is not allowed. The whole Jordan River, at the beginning in the Tiberias Lake, is put in the national water carrier and goes to different issues for cities, but also for irrigating cotton in the desert, Negev desert. Incredible. Palestinians cannot build new wells, even in their territories. They are not allowed to give water to the Gaza Strip, for instance. So water is an essential element for collapsing life, even in West Bank, under a strategy that is not a war strategy properly. It's more than this. You have explained very well before in the session. It is a strategy in which genocide deal with occupation forever if they can.
One more, I think, and that may be the last one. Okay.
Hi, my name is Mohammed Dawood. I'm from Indian Administered Kashmir. So my question is to you, sir. So you talked about many things around the world, human rights violations and all the stuff. Do you have any report on Indian Administered Kashmir? I mean, you said that in most of the countries, for the sake of beautification, they chop down trees, mountains, and all the stuff. And same happened in Jammu and Kashmir. So do you have any report on this? What had happened there? I mean, 86,000 feet where trees were chopped down for the sake of roads, which were used by army. So do you have any report on this, or do you have worked on this, or not? It's a serious issue. Is this not a serious issue for you?
It is, of course, a very serious issue, and we do receive some specific complaints, including recently certain allegations that involve destruction of housing, including for security measures. We continue to monitor that in my office, and we are in the process of sort of building more, data and verifications about these allegations. But it's well known that the security policies in the Kashmir Valley have led to many gross violations of human rights, including in the area of housing and food, for example. Orchards have been destroyed, and agricultural produce harvested from orchards have rotted away in trucks and been unable to reach, for example, markets because of restrictions on transportation. There has been not an access to home demolitions as a punitive measure in Kashmir, as we are beginning to see in many other states in India. But we have certainly seen mass attacks on the allegation that a single individual in a village might have been responsible for a single act. In other words, we've seen examples of collective punishment. And this has been verified and reported in various UN reports, even predating my appointment as a special rapporteur. Now, in terms of my own work on domicide, which is basically a term that I gave to mass destruction of housing in conflict, and I submitted a report on it 2 years ago when Russian bombing of Ukraine was on everybody's mind. And then, of course, in the context of Gaza, it's become extremely relevant right now. But I do believe that there has been a slow-moving version of domicide happening across many parts of India, including in Kashmir. And this has to be, of course, one of the issues that must remain as focal points for international community's attention. And as long as I'm the rapporteur, I will continue to do my best to verify information and reports that I receive, to report to the international community about what I find.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Yeah, I think we are almost a full hour, so thank you all for coming and thank you to our experts.